This should be information that underlines what we need to do to move this country forward. Well, hello, everybody. It's David Leis, your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier, live on this March the 19th, 2026, the year of our Lord. And we're so glad that you can join us today for yet another important policy discussion that certainly matters to all Canadians. And this has to do with the phenomenon of floor crossers, the phenomenon of, representatives who you thought you elected to represent you in some fashion under some party banner who cross the floor. And what does this mean? Has this happened before? Because we know through history there's been a number of these. Well, if we put our political scientist hats on, these are unique species, but they do happen throughout history. And so we're going to dive into that with a extraordinary panel. I think you'll be delighted by who we have on, people who bring kind of that view of political science, but also their experience as elected officials. So stay tuned for that one. We really appreciate your feedback and comments as usual, and I want to highlight a few comments just before we dive into some news headlines. Starting off with comments from you, and we've certainly welcomed them. Great show, very informative. Thanks so much. And that's from Frozen123. And I think that was from last week. Thanks, David, for airing this vital subject. I write with interest and concern for Canada. Keep up the good work, David. Walden Smith, thank you. And as we look to the next set of the program today, I know that you'll be interested to weigh in on this topic and what does it mean to you? What do you think about floor crossers? So stay tuned. So in terms of some headlines, I think one of the big stories that unfolded just this week on the appeal deadline was, of course, the federal government's decision to appeal the use of the Emergencies Act use during the convoy protest to the Supreme Court. What do you think about that? I'll ask our panel for their brief reaction on that big topic. That's significant. Meantime, in Kingston, Ontario, where Sir John A. Macdonald's statue was taken down, among other places in this country, there is indications that most Kingstonians want the statue back up. In fact, over 70%, according to a recent poll by Nanos Research, reveals that 71% of people want that statue back up. So what do you think? Is it important to honor our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, and the father of Confederation and the man who built the Canadian Railway? And that's a story from the National Post. I also wanted to mention that the Bank of Canada is holding its rate at 2.25%, saying the war in Iraq will likely boost global inflation. We'll see what happens when it comes to that. And I know that the projections on the economy have been moderated again. You may recall that the February job numbers were pretty bad as we looked at some 84,000 job losses. And speaking of the war, I just wanted to mention verbally an interesting story on two accounts, and that is that you may recall that the Strait of Hormuz is a very important choke point for oil trade and through that region, and it supplies a significant amount of the oil going to Asia, among other countries, including Europe, and that the Trump administration requested European allies to help clear the way for that strait. And the most recent word was that, in fact, some help may come on its way when earlier it had said no. In Canada's case, it's interesting. I noticed today that the Minister of Defense, according to a Juno News source, has said that the minister is looking at possible involvement in some form, but not on any kind of active offensive way. So I'm not sure what that means, but stay tuned on that one. Also, I wanted to mention that an interesting story in Manitoba is it's been revealed that there is a trade envoy that has been hired by the province, and the pay package is significant. Apparently, it's about $500,000 a year. So this is a significant sum of money. I suppose that's in part because the envoy, I think, is based in Washington, where you need American dollars. So maybe the exchange rate has something to do with that. In other news, I wanted to highlight that a fascinating story about technology, and it's from Spain, where a fellow was able to hack into a whole network of 7,000 robotic vacuums and was able to get full camera access. Do you have a robot vacuum? Well, you might want to check your security provision. I don't know the details of this, but it really has hit the headlines around the world as a man was able to access all those video feeds within people's homes. Go figure. And it's always reassuring to hear that CRA is coming into the 21st century. They have discontinued, I believe, the fax machine option for tax submissions. And pardon me, they're suspending the fax line for charity filings at the month's end. So it's remarkable that the fax machine, I believe, came into existence through Xerox Corporation some 60 years ago. Go figure. All right, so now we want to turn to our program, and I want to introduce our panel. Very dynamic group. I have the Honorable Dan McTeague, a former Liberal MP. He's also the president of Canadians for Affordable Energy. Welcome, Dan.
David, good to be here. Thank you.
Great to see you, my friend. And then we also have former MP Robert-Falcon Ouellette. And Robert is a well-spoken chap, and he's also a professor at the University of Ottawa and also a chaplain with the Armed Forces. So a warm welcome to you, Robert. Great to see you. And then, of course, the great Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie, Vice President of Research at Frontier, and he is a frequent guest. So a warm welcome, Marco.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Well, as you can see, we've got a dynamic panel, and I can't resist asking you for a comment or a reaction to the federal government's decision to appeal the decisions by two federal courts, that they're going to take it to the Supreme Court and appeal that decision that deemed the use of it as illegal. Who wants to go first on that one? Robert, do you want to go first, and then Dan, and then Marco?
Sure. I don't think the federal government had a choice but to appeal it. I think even if they've been ruled against twice, they don't know what the Supreme Court might say. It's a court which is a little bit closer to Ottawa. They were in the thick of it as well, seeing the Freedom Convoy. And I think it's important for the federal government to defend what powers that they've legislated for themselves. Whether it's right or wrong, I think it was kind of predictable that the federal government would take that step.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Dan?
I think the federal court ruling was damning to the government, and I think a bit of a surprise to everyone that's out there. I agree that it buys the government more time, as much as it might give some the impression that the Carney government is no different than the Trudeau government. It's sort of a quick chance of last resort, and I think that's one of the ideas is to keep this out of the headlines until such times as the decision is made. But if the decision is affirmed, if it confirms what the federal court has said, then I think it's fair to say that the government will have a lot of explaining to do.
Thank you, Dan. Marco?
Yeah, I think they're certainly trying to buy time. And in my view, they're trying to protect the members of the government who were around the cabinet table who participated in making the unconstitutional decision. It places the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in a bit of a bind because he declared very publicly his views on the protesters, calling them names even. And now this file comes to his desk. And so he will either have to recuse himself, perhaps, and that causes certain issues, or sit during the decision, and that would call into question some of the neutrality of the court.
Well said. Yeah, very interesting discussion. So we'll eagerly watch and observe how that unfolds. So what do you think about that, audience? And we see the audience comments coming in. Good afternoon, Prairie, again. And we've just got so many people that are regulars, and we really appreciate that. A comment here, the federal government needs to stop wasting taxpayer money with, quote, frivolous appeals that don't make sense and are vindictive in nature. And that's from Robert Kerr. So turning to today's program, we've got a bit of an agenda here that I did want to highlight, and it has to do with floor crossers. Today, we're going to ask, what are floor crossers? As we put our political scientist caps on, does this happen very often as we look at history? What's the impact? Is this good for democracy? Does this enable us to have a greater trust in democracy, or does it undermine it? What do you think? And what are the policy solutions? And I'll get to the point on policy solutions with a very simple one, and that has to do with, well, quite frankly, should there be a law that if there is a floor crossing that would say precipitate a by-election? So what do you think? We'll get to that in a moment with our panel and your comments. So I want to just start off with also a very interesting point, and that has to do with who are the floor crossers the last while. There's 4 of them, and not to pick on them, but they stepped forward to cross the floor, and we just want to remind people who they are. There's, of course, most recently in reverse chronological order from Nunavut, MP Lori Idlout, and pardon my pronunciation. And the next one is, of course, Edmonton MP Matt General. And then we have Markham Unionville MP Michael Maw. And, of course, Acadie Annapolis MP Chris Dautremont. And I should just mention that the last 3 were from the Conservatives to the Liberals. And of course, the Nunavut MP was from the NDP crossing to the Liberals. So I want to just turn to our panel and ask you, what's your immediate reaction? Dan, do you want to go first?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, many members of parliament are often, swooned by other parties and discussed, jokingly usually, about, hey, why don't you come on over to us? Or, here's an offer you can't refuse, and your party's going nowhere. Therefore, why would you want to rest your oars on a sinking ship? I mean, and that conversation does happen. That it materializes into what appears to be a serial move by several to join the Liberal Party, effectively creating affecting the balance of power from a minority to a majority, has enormous implications simply beyond whether the member of parliament has the privilege, and they do have that privilege. That's their privileges or their right to do this, but it's highly incongruent with the public expectation, especially when in a charged environment where you have a minority government. Now, having said all this, it's clear that each one of them has their own reasons. I don't know the last one from the NDP very well, but I can say with the first 3, no surprise. One wanted to be speaker. The party said they weren't going to support him as they wanted someone else. The second one, of course, didn't bother consulting any of his constituents, and there we see him on the trade mission, or the mission that Mark Carney had to China. And rumors now abound he may actually wind up being an ambassador. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. And for Mr. Genereux, of course, there had been real concerns about expressed by himself that he just didn't want to be around anymore, wasn't going to run again, and just wanted to sit it out. So all of these things, cast that sort of, well, we don't know why they're doing it, and there's, maybe the grass is greener on the other side. Whatever the case may be, it does corrode the public trust in officials and makes a mockery of members of parliament who simply say, well, I'm going to switch for whatever reason. We have seen this in the past, to be sure. I remember Joe Camuzzi and another member, his name escapes me right now, David from your neck of the woods, BC, who did the same thing. Emerson, thank you. But they were very far apart, but usually because they were not happy with the direction the party was taking, and again, saw things being better on the other side. But at the end of the day, members of parliament, you dance with them that brung you. And I'm firmly of the view that if you do such a thing, and were I to do such a thing, I would have to offer my name and resign the seat and create a by-election in order to make that effective. Parties do matter because the platforms are so fundamentally different, and you have to let Canadians make those decisions, not yourself.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan, for that initial reaction. And after I get your reaction, Robert and Marco, I did want to mention that I do have some further background that may shed a little bit more light on this from a perspective, including a clip. So, Robert, your reaction?
Yeah, wasn't really surprised. I think she had been kind of telecasting or, kind of saying out loud that she was considering it, but she wasn't really certain. But and to see, and I kind of heard a little bit in some of the chatter with other people that she might be considering crossing the floor. Ironically enough, actually, in Nunavut, this is not the first time they've had an MP cross the floor. Their first time was in actually 1982 with the very first Inuit MP in Canadian history, Peter Itnoir. He crossed the floor from the NDP to the Liberals under Pierre Trudeau at the time. And he did so because he wanted to promote the idea of creating the territory of Nunavut. And it was the big thing that he was trying to get move forward. He actually talked about this where he said when he raised the issue with Ed Broadbent, the NDP leader at the time, Ed just kind of laughed at him and brushed him off, and he wasn't very satisfied with that response. And incredibly enough, we have Nunavut today. It seemed to have led to getting things done for his constituents. So I'm sure a lawyer who knows the history quite well had consulted quite widely before she crossed the floor. Obviously, there's people who are very partisan, but as we know in the territories, they don't even have political parties in their legislature or in their assembly. Mm-hmm. It's a much more open system, more consensus based. And I heard the premier of Nunavut talking, and he said he supports his MP and whatever party she's with, as long as she's able to advocate for the people of Nunavut. Now, doesn't mean that I agree completely with her. I think she probably should have resigned as well. I don't think she has a mandate from her citizens. She needs to put her name forward to really confirm what I'm doing is the best possible path forward. I will resign and I will seek a by-election. And Mark Carney, obviously, I think he could have called one pretty quick. And I think she probably would have won with the way the polls are at the federal level. And I think it would have helped her career and just solidified how honorable and how strong she was. And so, I have a lot more to say. I don't know how much I'm allowed to say, but I just think, a lot of the MPs who do cross the floor, it seems so cold-hearted. When Michael Ma crossed the floor, he was at the Christmas party, and then he crossed that floor the next day at another Christmas party. I was talking to a couple Liberal MPs, and they said that it was cold. We laughed about it. We'd never seen anyone so cold as that, stone-faced, shameless, shaking hands one minute and then knife and then in the hand in the next. In politics, we do have an issue with looking honorable. We're often not seen as in that honorable lights. And, I know you mentioned, David, having a law perhaps to impede people crossing the floor and having to sit as independents. There was a time in Canadian politics when you didn't need these laws. People acted honorably. This was among nobles, and people would, even if it became a minister, for example, they would actually resign and seek a mandate from their people again to say, I will also be a minister and an MP, doing two roles concurrently. And that, I think, is missing too often in our politics today. When Jody Raybald Wilson resigned from the government, she didn't cross the floor to the NDP or to the Conservative Party. She sat as an independent. Mm-hmm. And her career afterwards, I think, while it was suffering for her political career, I think Canadians' esteem of her was actually raised, and more people were able to say this is a good and honorable person. And Lori would do well to follow in that example.
Very interesting comments. And the use of the word honorable, and what does that mean? So well said, Robert. It's interesting.
Except, did you know, David, that we're honorable only inside the house, not outside?
Oh, yeah.
Technically, the title, I don't know if Dan, you have the same thing, but, I wasn't made a member of the Privy Council, so I don't have the title honorable, but inside the house, we were all honorable members.
Well, very good. Well, I think you're all honorable in my book. On another note, I noticed that in the Epoch Times, as a quick note, Nunavut MP Lori Idlout said she decided to join the Liberals because of, quote, new threats against our sovereignty, impacting the North, adding it would be more effective to be part of the government to represent her region. And that's in her words. Marco, I know that he's available here. What is your immediate reaction to these phenomenon of floor crossings recently?
Well, I am surprised and I'm not. I am surprised at the extent to which the government seems to have organized itself and have the sort of recruitment platoon going around the ranks of the opposition. But I am not surprised because historically this is a feature of the system. We have to remember that when the Westminster system sort of comes into being in its current form, more or less in the 19th century, there is this idea that there are no political parties in Parliament, in the British Parliament, in the Canadian Parliament, and so there are coalitions, and people cross floors left, right, and center all the time, and are enticed to do it. But there were different rules back then. One of them was the honor that has been mentioned, right? People were honorable and were bound by the certain unwritten rules. But I think we should make some kind of distinction, and Dan mentioned the motivations. Not all floor crossings are created equal. Some people cross floors out of conviction. And Edmund Burke talked about this, right? That we elect individuals and we elect them on the basis of their sort of moral makeup, and therefore we cannot expect them to violate their own moral conscience. And so when things change, they ought to be able to do that. The second version or the second distinction is when the conditions change in a sort of material way. I'm thinking of Scott Bryson, for example, or his argument anyway, when he changed from the Conservatives to the Liberals, arguing that the party that he had belonged to and was a member of had changed. And indeed it had changed because there was a merger between the old Reformers and the Tories. And the third one, of course, is the more transactional one, which is what we're seeing now, where people are perhaps being enticed to move across the floor for promises of jobs and or spending or perks or Lord knows. The most evident example of this, to show that this is really not a partisan phenomenon, is Belinda Stronach, when in 2005, I think it was, she switched floors from, out of the blue from one morning to the next. One morning she is in the opposition as a critic, and the next morning before noon comes around, she is a minister of the Crown. And so that's really more of a transactional issue. And by the looks of it, people can make up their own minds. These four seem to be quite transactional.
Wow. So there you have it, folks. There's the initial reactions from our panel. I think it's fascinating how we've done a little bit of a breakdown as we think about, well, what about the transactions here? Is that what's in play here? A quid pro quo. You join us and we'll give you this. Or how does this relate to members' conscience? We elect people, representatives, to represent us. And we trust their judgment to carry the ball for us. And so all these themes have been alluded to and more. I want to share this clip with you about further reactions and then also share with you an interesting poll.
The Liberals gain another MP, this time from the NDP, putting Prime Minister Mark Carney just 2 seats away from a majority. And he'll have a chance to nab that majority next month in 3 by-elections. Nunavut MP Laurie Idlout is now the 4th MP in 4 months to cross the floor to the Liberals.
It is a great pleasure. One of Canada's greatest constituency MPs. You represent a riding that is the size of Mexico, and very down to earth. And we've had conversations about what we can do, both large and small. in Nunavut.
Like with any complicated issue, it wasn't just one thing that happened. There are a variety of many things that have allowed me to really reflect on this, and I'm very thankful to be so warmly welcomed.
Of course, opposition MPs are not welcoming the news.
To us, the decision of voters at the ballot box is a sacred trust. And if a member of Parliament wants to override that decision, we believe they must go back to the voters and make that case to them and receive a renewed mandate.
When I went door knocking in my riding in the South Kelowna area, people said that they felt that members of Parliament should not, especially just after running in an election for one team, suddenly switch and reverse all their principles. So the member of Parliament needs to speak to her constituents in regards to that.
You know, trust is a big thing with any voter, but especially in Nunavut. And so to see somebody that, has been decrying on food costs and affordability and all those issues for this government that's been in power now for the last 10 years, and now all of a sudden to join that caucus, that's difficult for a lot of people to swallow.
So there's a lot of difficult swallowing going on in Ottawa. So I want to ask you, what do you think about that? Should there be an automatic by-election triggered here? And as you think about that, and I'll go to you, Robert, first, because you've alluded to that, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre accused the Liberals of making, quote, backroom deals. He said, quote, Mark Carney is using backroom deals to seize a costly majority that voters rejected, which will enable Liberals to balloon debt, inflate the cost of living, block resources, and turn criminals loose on our streets. And that's Pierre Poilievre said in a post on social media. So, Robert, what do you think? Should there be an automatic trigger and says, if you want to cross the floor, you go back to your constituency and ask them, what do you think?
That's a good question. I haven't made up my mind on that one, but I certainly do think it would be more honorable if they went back to their constituents. And I know there's always occasions when sometimes people want to vote against their own government, their own party, and I've done that in the past. When I was in Parliament, I was actually I thought it was important to represent my constituents and not just the political party. I remember talking to Justin Trudeau at the time about this, and he said, well, you're supposed to be the voice of your constituents and not the voice of Ottawa, so you need to represent them. And so sometimes I would be offside, but that at the same time, it's better to be behind closed doors when you can actually deal with some of these issues, to have that influence. Opposition members, it's not that they don't have a role to play, but often that role can be very loud in public, in the media. But then when it comes time for the minister or the prime minister or his chiefs of staff and all the ministries to make a decision, sometimes they're listening to their own party members. And so I think with Lori or Michael Ma or Matt Generu, they really wanted to be behind that closed door so they can help influence the policies in the way they think is to the betterment of their constituents and perhaps all Canadians. Should they resign? I think so. I think they should have the courage of their convictions at some point to face the electorate, to say, get behind me. But most of the time, I just don't see politicians doing it because I think they know when you cross the floor so close after an election, people get very mad at them. You have people in your own political party that invest money, energy. They put all their hopes into you. And if you are elected, that's not a small feat. And that means you have a functioning political party within your riding. And they probably feel a great sense of betrayal if you cross the floor. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of these people see this is thicker than blood politics. You cross the floor, you've not just betrayed your family. This is even thicker than the blood of one's family. People take it very seriously.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Robert. And you used an interesting word, betrayal. I mean, you've got a whole team of people that believed in you. And so if you switch sides, wow, I think that comes with a great price. So well said. Dan McTeague, what's the right answer on this one?
I don't think there is. And that's why this makes it so obvious and open for debate and opinion. And the opinions are highly charged, and they have to be. Mm-hmm. I think the one takeaway from this is that it happened so quickly after an election. How could someone have a change of heart? And it comes back to what I indicated at the beginning. I think these are a lot of very deeply personal matters of people either with egos. Hard to talk about egos in politics. Robert knows a lot about that. But people who may have felt, listen, I've had enough of minority governments. I mean, you've had one since 2021. You've got another one in 26. You've had one in 19. You haven't had a majority government in quite some time. Robert, I can speak from experience. Any moment the election could be triggered. That means resources expended. You got to think about not just your work as a member of parliament and the obligation you have to be away, but also keeping an eye on when that election is triggered. So you got your back there, and people. A lot of my constituents, and I think the same would be for Robert and others, thought I was a municipal official. I mean, why shouldn't I be there every weekend? Why shouldn't I be there every Friday night? Why shouldn't I be there every Monday night? So I think for a lot of MPs, the question comes down to, maybe a majority government provides greater stability, and having a situation where another election can be triggered at any time, and it's likely that could happen. I'm not saying it would happen, but if minority governments tend to, by tradition, except for the recent examples, be only a year and a half to 2 years, many of these MPs are probably saying I'd prefer a little bit more time before I decide to retire or before the public decides to get rid of me. Either way, I think the fact that this is such a tight, very strong minority government, potentially leading to a majority government, is one of the main motivators. There could be many others, and I can only hear people talking about why certain ones did this or did that. But it does come down to the question of trust in an environment where people basically say, well, if seat switching is so easy, maybe Robert and I could have moved a motion in the House of Commons to have an automatic floor. They're rebuilding the House of Commons, maybe up to the other side without much notice. If only that were true, we could run by consensus. But at the end of all of this, it's pretty clear that there will be an actual demand that this be formalized in law, not something that is given the privilege or the prerogative of members of parliament. It's one more thing that will probably go to the wayside come next election, because that is going to be an issue that's going to be right front and center whenever that election should be here.
Interesting. So you think that could be formalized, this kind of trigger in the law?
It's inevitable. Yeah. I think Bloc will call for it. Likely the NDP will support it. The Conservatives will go for it. And ultimately, I think if the shoe were on the other foot, the Liberals would want it too. I was there at that time when those things happened.
Okay, well said. Marco, your response? What's the solution here?
There are some solutions, and I kind of like the floor crossing stuff because it's sort of dramatic, right? At the end of the war, Winston Churchill, who himself crossed the floor twice in his career, gave an impassionate speech about, or against rather, the desire to rebuild the House of Commons, the chamber, into a kind of a semicircle. The way, for example, that they have the legislature in Brussels, and his main argument, and again he was very impassioned, was that it would remove the drama of crossing the floor. He said, right? Because to him it was sort of kind of wimpish that if you have to switch codes, so to speak, then you have to go through this walk that you have to get across, and that makes one wonder and ponder the actions and the reactions. So up until 1931 in Canada, it was the law that ministers, when appointed, would have to resign their seat and run in a by-election. Now, think about what that does. The idea was, of course, to try to prevent people from getting sweet deals on the side and let the voters decide. So perhaps something like that could be brought back. I remind everyone that up until recently, Manitoba actually did pass legislation at the provincial level that if you cross the floor, you'd have to essentially go to a by-election, and that was removed by the Conservatives. In 12, I think it was, the record reflects that the current leader of the opposition voted against a motion to put constraints on floor crossing, right? So again, this is part of the game, and everybody plays it, and everybody is indignant when it happens to them and super happy when they are the perpetrators. But the reality is, this is a constitutional issue. There are issues that relate to gifts and enticements and corruptions. According to Section 119 of the Criminal Code, it is illegal to entice a member of parliament through some kind of bribe or whatever to make decisions in exchange for such gifts and favors, right?
Marco, did you see the image when you saw Lori walk into the caucus room on the Wednesday there, and people were giving her hugs, and the week before they probably would have been hissing at her or something like that across the way in the house, and today it's all hugs and everyone's so joyous, and it's this incredible moment, and hallelujah, we raise our hands to the sky.
Yeah. And that brings me back just to close to Dan's point earlier, that all of these shenanigans essentially undermine the trust that people have in the decisions that politicians make, and reflects badly on the decisions also that voters make, because they choose them. And so that level of cynicism is not good for the workings of the House, for the political community, and generally speaking, for public debate.
Well said. I love this discussion. It certainly says, depending on your perspective, are they unprincipled or are they principled? Is it just fancy rationalizations? It's interesting, the comments from the audience. Kelly 5729, or sorry, Kelly A. It says everyone that crossed was offered perks. That is very clear. Look at how the floor crossers were treated by our implanted leader. And Sheridan Ford says, agreed. I advise Canadians the trust is earned, not given. These floor crossers prove the trust of the citizens only matters until the politicians have their vote, and then they can legally trample your trust and disregard it. And I think that's a well said point, Sheridan, that many Canadians look at this and say, you know what? The world isn't perfect, but you need to hang in there with the principles, the brand that we chose to elect you. And so if you're always floor crossing, how is there going to be any kind of accountability? So I want to bring up an interesting poll that was done by CTV News Nanos that talks a little bit about, the question of where the public is at. And it's fascinating. It's basically a third, when asked, if a member of parliament, an MP, decides to change political parties, what should happen? And it basically said one choice was an MP who wants to change parties should resign and seek a new mandate through a special by-election under the new party. So that's one option. A second option was an MP who wants to change parties should be allowed to do so. And then finally, the third response was an MP who disagrees with the party they were elected under should sit as an independent until the next election. And I think that kind of reflects the dilemma that we've outlined as a panel here. And so we'll see where this goes. And I guess my question is also in the context of the number of seats in our House. We've got a lot of things going on here. If we bring up kind of a model here of how many MPs we have in the House, we know that there's a total of 343 seats. A majority required is 172. And then we also have a situation where we've got 3 by-elections coming up. So assuming that the Liberals might come in and win those 3 ridings, the majority could be achieved. What's your take on this, Dan?
Well, it looks like they're going to win those 3 seats. They were Liberal seats, with the exception of one that was won by 1. Yeah, the Liberals held that by 1. Going into this, I think some of the reasoning members of Parliament gave to joining the Liberals was that they were surging in the polls, and that many of them, if you look at what I can't say the case of Matt Genereux, but certainly the case of say, Chris D'Entremont or Mr. Ma, or maybe even Ms. Linda. It's possible that they won by very narrow margins, and therefore a surge on the Liberal side, apart from giving them the perks that come with being a government member, more travel, better committees, usually even standing on committees. Right now, the opposition has control of most of the committees. If you have a change in the House where it is a majority of members of Parliament of one party, they tend to be able to control committees, and that's where a lot of the investigation, a lot of the ideas, a lot of the real work takes place behind scenes. Can be brooked or can be changed or altered or shut down altogether. For most Canadians, however, I think the idea is, a bit of a shoulder shrug. Most Canadians right now, and like last year, maybe the year before, are deeply concerned about, the stuff I've been working on, affordability, energy prices, food prices. And that, I think, is more of a gauge of where people are heading, one way or another, whether they support the direction we currently have or not. But it's certainly top of mind as opposed to worrying about members of Parliament who decide to change their mind based on whim or principle.
So, Marco, do you see how do you see this unfolding in terms of the possibility that we'll see a majority after the by-elections happen in April?
I think there probably be a majority, and this is the concerning issue, which is also a constitutional issue. In the Westminster system, our system of government, the House is the boss of the government. The government works for the members of Parliament. And so that's the whole principle of responsibility and accountability of the governing body. What the current state of affairs is that it has turned the House of Commons into a recruiting ground to invert that particular arrangement. And so what that also creates essentially is a slavish bunch of people sitting across the floor, perhaps worrying or pretending or wanting to cross the floor sometime in the future. This last floor crosses kind of hints that there were issues worked out well in advance of the announcement so that it wouldn't look bad. And so this essentially turns the logic and of the constitutionality of the House of Commons and its relationship to the government on its head. The government derives its authority from the House, is not supposed to be a market for talent.
What are your thoughts, Robert, on Marco's comments? Because it seems like this is kind of a dangerous game. We're kind of whittling down the trust that people have in Parliament as people seek to kind of advance their own parliamentary careers. Am I being too cynical here?
Well, politics is politics. The House of Commons is a very tense place at times, but that's because the whole nation, all their interests converge in one space. And, generally don't fight out in the streets with wars and guns. We fight with words and debate and joust inside the House. But for me, actually, I think it just demonstrates how strategic Mark Carney has been and what Canadians did elect in Mark Carney. I guess he did not receive a majority, but he's going to get one. And I think it's due to the work of the three wise men, I'm calling them, Mark Carney, Michael Sebia, and Marc-André Blanchard, his chief of staff and the chief clerk of the Privy Council, as well as Mark Carney, the Prime Minister. These three individuals who know each other for quite some time have been working very pragmatically on getting what they want to see done in the House of Commons. I don't think they take the House of Commons itself too seriously. I think they're much more focused on the machinery of government. But I think, this, even if the government has a majority, I don't think this is the end of, I think this is just the beginning of Mark Carney's issues, because any one of his MPs could start negotiating and saying, well, you've given something to Laurie Ouellette, you've given something to Michael Ma. What about me and my constituents? What are you doing for my riding? And otherwise, I need to think about my people, and I need some help. Val Mulroon was really supportive of his MPs. I know that he had really great loyalty for the 2 terms, even when he was extremely unpopular. His MPs were realized how good of a caucus manager he was. I don't think Mark Carney is quite there yet, but I also think that one of the issues is that would help reduce the amount of floor crossing is the ability for MPs not to be kicked out of their own caucus. And Justin Trudeau was quite bad with this. If you disagreed with him, he would kick you out. He wouldn't even bring it to a vote. I know that there was a law, the Parliament of Canada Act, or something similar from the MP, the Conservative former minister under Stephen Harper. But you have the ability for caucus to decide if they kick out the leader, and they have to vote at the beginning of the parliament. But the caucus is allowed also is supposed to be the one to decide if someone remains a member of caucus or not. And Justin Trudeau would just kick the member out. So he told a number of people, you're just no longer a member of the caucus. And I think there should be repercussions for that. It should be against the law. There should be a heavy fine for the prime minister, the leader, to pay. And it should not be allowed, because I think that reduces the ability for the member to have that valve to let off steam, to tell his party what his constituents want, and to hold the government to account, to hold their own leadership to account. And that's important, because if you can't do that, sometimes you feel you have no other choice. I got to cross the floor to send the message I need to send. Mm-hmm. But I also want to mention real quick, I know this is, I'm not sure how much more time we have, but Laurie crossing the floor, I think just demonstrates how dead the NDP is. They are in the death zone at this point. They have climbed Mount Everest, and I'm not sure if they're going to be able to make it back down, because I'm not sure who their leader is they're going to choose. They're not even anywhere close to official party status. They might pick an extremist to be their leader, and A.V. Lewis. And if they do that, they're not representing the working class anymore. They're representing these very niche special interests. And I think the Conservatives and the Liberals are doing a much better job of trying to talk to the things that Dan was talking about: affordability, looking after people's pocketbooks and making sure that they can put food on the table, gasoline in their car, and get to work and look after their kids.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're getting near the end of our discussion. So I want to ask you, I think, a strategic question. And that relates to, what does this drive towards a majority government mean in terms of the kind of flavor of public policy that we anticipate the federal government pursuing? And just a quick note here, and it relates back to what kind of government are we dealing with? Because there's often the reference this last week that the Carney government has been in power now for 1 year. 1 year. So how do you evaluate that objectively in terms of outcomes? Because we know that the Trudeau government has really, we're a stagnated country. I mean, on virtually every measure. I think this is the fact. I mean, surely that should be obvious to every Canadian by now. And people have an anxiousness in terms of our future. We see this poll after poll. So the question then is, what is really going on behind the scenes? Help me understand, is the Carney government's drive to get a majority now, is that part of being able to actually make bold moves forward? Or is it going to be bold moves in terms of more of the same as the Trudeau government? Dan, do you want to take a crack at that, and then Marco?
Yeah, very good points. Robert made some excellent ones there too. And I think being a majority makes you impervious to accountability to a large extent. And of course, you can be drilled every single day. You can have the speaker, rather the opposition leader, and other opposition members give great questions. But the real true face of Carney or the Liberals, I think, will be revealed once they cross and get the majority, which they covet, which is understandable. Every government does, every party does. But once you have that, it changes, as I alluded to, the dynamic in committees and votes, and you can shut down anything you want. Nothing gets investigated. I agree with Robert. I think the Trudeau era was extraordinarily damaging to the integrity of members of Parliament as far as their right to speak up and speak out and be open. There was a time where members like myself voted 150 times against my own party, depending on bills that weren't really part of our agenda.
No kidding.
Oh, yeah, no kidding. And at a time where you could get members of Parliament on the other side to work with you to pass private members' bills. Yeah, I passed a few, not just small ones. Changes the criminal code. That's not about me, though. It's about how I think the system has changed, where it doesn't give enough safety valves to the fact that members of Parliament can achieve something without being perceived as anti-party or
Exactly.
anti-theory that's behind it. That has to change, and there has to be that rigidity taken away. What happens, though, is that once Mr. Carney develops the ability to have a majority government, he's basically got a free hand for the next 2 to 3 years to do pretty much as he wants. And perhaps some of the things that have surprised, especially, I'm going to give the example of the Greens and the climate crew out there, really upset with the EV mandate being booted out, upset with the carbon tax going. All of these things may very well come back in vogue, and it won't really matter where Canadians stand, because you are truly shielded from the scrutiny of the public. And I got to say, it's not a comment that I make is very, with great ease. I mean, you don't have media in the position where it once held members of Parliament and government to account as the Fifth Estate, as it did during my time. You sneeze sideways, you were front page of every paper in the country, and that meant a lot because people read and they actually watched legacy media. But I digress. It gives Mr. Carney an extremely important hand in being able to deliver his vision for Canada at a time in which the country, and I think you referred to it, by every metric, is going in the wrong direction.
Thank you, Dan. Marco, your comment?
I think there is a bit of a paradox here. The quest to have a majority government is the quest to essentially have uncontested power in the chamber. And this is not new. This has been going on. This centralization of power at the executive has been going on for quite a while. We remember somebody else named Trudeau who said that MPs X number of feet from the from the hill were nobodies, right? And so that really points at the level to which the executive has become centralized. And Mr. Carney, being a central banker, I don't mean that as a pun, has a kind of ethos that his way is what must be done because he knows better. He has this sort of technocratic soul about him. And so his desire to have a majority government seems somewhat incommensurate with the powers, considering that there have been in the Canadian setting minority governments that have decided to govern as majority governments, basically, and get things done. So it's not a prerequisite necessarily to have a razor thin majority in order to govern. But I want to go back to a point that that was made earlier by Robert, is that by achieving this sort of very thin minority, and the method by which he achieves it, which is essentially by poaching people from across the floor, he then becomes subject to that kind of, I don't want to say blackmail, but demands from the other side, not just from the recent floor crosses, but basically from anyone on his side to say, give me this, do this, I want this pushed, or else I'm going to cross on the other side. That's not likely going to happen every time, but I'm saying it opens up the possibility, which then paradoxically weakens his ability to get anything that he wants done by achieving such thin majority.
All right. So there you have it, folks. We've got a very interesting time as it appears the federal government is moving towards a majority. I think it's also fascinating. It's worth noting that there's a lot of polls out there that seems to be indicating that the Liberals have a significant amount of support right now. I've seen some 46%. I mean, this is in significant majority territory if an election was held today. So what's the significance of those polls, Robert? What does that mean when this is all juxtaposed to a Canadian state of our economy that is very worrisome for people. There's a precarity. I mean, I think some pollsters even use that word to show that many Canadians feel precarious as they look at their situation and the concern about trade and all kinds of matters. How do you explain that popularity? What's going on here?
Well, the popularity, I think, is due because Mark Carney has an image of being the fatherly looking figure. He seems to be in control. He seems to know what he's doing. He seems to be have a manager, and he has a worldliness around him. And I think people want to look to him in this very troubled world where there's multiple wars and what's going on down in the United States. And he seems to be that person who can anchor us in a reality of nostalgia that may or may not exist. Now, Mark Carney, I've been to House of Commons a number of times over the past year wanting to see him in question period. I've never actually been able to see him in question period. Every time I show up, he's not there. I see him leaving just before question period with this convoy of RCMP officers and protective security go into the Prime Minister's office, and I go, raise my hands. I missed him. But I do get to see Pierre and Don Davies and a few others and the Bloc Québécois leaders. But so I'm not really sure how Mark Carney views the House of Commons. I think he sees it very pragmatically. I don't think it's his main thing. He's not a parliamentarian by nature. He's more of a manager. He doesn't see the value in this institution. But he might be made aware of the value of this institution in the long term, because this is where Canadians come to talk about their issues. And not all Canadians follow politics, but the ones who do at some point will make a decision about how well the government is doing. And Mark Carney is very pragmatic. He seems to be, he's going to get his majority. He might go for a bigger majority as it kind of progresses. I know that there's an NDP seat perhaps in Quebec with Alexandre Boris, the lone NDP MP from Quebec, who might be going to provincial politics. They might be able to pick that seat up as well. But, as the parliament goes on, he's going to be trying to grow that majority a little bit. I think with the polls where they are, he probably wanted to have an election. I think it was kind of like, let's do an election. But now I think it pushes, says, well, you've got your majority. You don't need an election. I think that's actually even better for Pierre Poilievre. It gives the Conservatives some breathing room and time to look for the weaknesses within the Mark Carney government, to find out where there's what that Achilles heel is, and to then make a different case. They figured out Justin Trudeau pretty well. They had his number painted on his back, and they got him, but they pushed too hard, and they pushed him out the door with no parachute. Maybe not, but they will find the weakness of Mark Carney, it's for sure. But it might take a year or two to find that.
All right.
Those apples to come down.
No, it's fascinating comments, Robert. And as we wrap up our conversation today, I want to ask you, Dan and Marco, what are what for your final comment, and also with a view to saying, what do we do to ensure that the People's House, the House of Commons, where people need voices to be able to be healthy? How do you ensure that we renew it? I know there's been lots of discussion about that. I did want to highlight an interesting paper that was done at Frontier last year with former MP Dorothy Dobie on this exact topic. How do we renew our institutions? We need these institutions to be healthy so we can have a strong representative democratic system that enables good functioning policy. At least that's the theory. Any comment, Dan?
Oh, our institutions have taken more hits than the Bismarck, if you use an old expression. I mean, in reality, it doesn't. A lot of people sort of say, well, you don't need these things. You don't need law and order. You can just do things. We can have organized anarchy anytime you want. But there comes a point where there has to be validation of the system. And Robert has alluded to this correctly, and Marco, of course, giving back the famous comment that Trudeau Sr. had, shrugging his shoulders, saying nobody's 50 feet away from the House of Commons. That was very much pervasive in the 1970s and 80s, and it changed in the 1990s, only to revert back to a point where power and privilege was centralized. You do need to make sure that members of Parliament do, in fact, have the ability to speak up, parler le main, as we say in French, to speak
Mm-hmm.
out, but to
Right.
also have the ability to make and to get issues that their constituents are most concerned about universally, to the point where you can actually make a difference and maybe change Parliament to the belief that having another chevron on your arm, being a minister, is what it's all about, and being a good MP is just as rewarding, given that that's their highest office you can have. Now, of course, in order to invite a future generation, you have to be able to ensure that they come to represent something. And for all the effort of getting in there, Robert knows this, I know this, getting there is quite the hurdle. And if you are able to get through that and thread the needle and make your way through, you have to have at least a sense that there's some respect and boundaries. Parties, as Marco has pointed out, were not, came well after the creation of parliaments. They're an important vehicle, and they are very much an important part of how people who vote. And I was always reminded by Jacques Chrétien and many other leaders, never forget, you might represent 10%, but you're here because of what your party represents. That was sort of a signal. So party is extraordinarily important in terms of getting the agenda across. And I think we come at a time in which the world is having to go through a number of very serious challenges. At home, we need to make sure the public has confidence in institutions, because they've served us well for almost 2 centuries now.
All said. Marco?
Yes, let me pick up on the idea of parties, because parties are incredibly important. They are essentially organizing vehicles for government. In the old days when there were no parties, people will arrive in Parliament and sort of throw their hands up and say, what are we going to do now? But now parties help to organize and create platforms, and so they can get on with the business of government right away. Part of the problem is that parties have become disconnected from the people who vote for them. Right? There was a time, and I still remember, when people were semi-proud of belonging to a political party. Now, I bet you'd have difficulty if you talk to 10 people on the street for anyone to admit that, if they did belong to a political party, to admit that they belong to a political party. So there's this sort of rejection of the institution, or the sort of informal institution. That said, our system of government cannot properly work without a functioning, strong, robust House of Commons. And so the House of Commons needs to recover its authority and maybe its former glory. And it is up to Canadians to give it to the House of Commons. It has been wrestled away slowly by the executive power. More and more and more power has been concentrating in the hands of prime ministers and the prime minister's office. And so Canadians need to empower their MPs essentially to stand up to that and to reclaim the supremacy of Parliament.
Well said. Well, I want to thank all our members of our panel for this far-reaching conversation. We know that Parliament does matter because the people matter. And it's interesting, the most telling response, I think, to the floor crossers were the tens of thousands of people that called up and said, wait a sec, I don't appreciate that you crossed the floor. So floor crossing is paid attention to by the public, and that in itself is very heartening. So I want to thank you, Dan McTeague, for joining us, Marco Navarro-Genie, and of course, Robert-Falcon Ouellette for this conversation today.
Yeah, tough way.
And I want to thank you, the audience, for joining us today, as we've had a little bit more of a political science conversation about our institutions, and we appreciate your many comments and questions. And I want to encourage you to speak up as citizens. Your voice does matter, even though sometimes you may think otherwise. It does. And so in that context, I want to welcome you to join us next week at the same time, same place on Thursday. And we'll look forward to that conversation, and I wish you a great week.
Here at Frontier, we don't receive any government funding. We are nonpartisan, and we work for you. Find out more and support this important work by visiting fcpp.org today.